Say it again, the reporter demanded, her voice cutting through the hum of cameras and shifting bodies. And Ethan Caldwell didn't hesitate, didn't blink, didn't even look toward the back of the room where she stood. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his tailored jacket and repeated it into a forest of microphones. That baby isn't mine. And just like that, the room fractured into whispers, flashes bursting like small explosions. Headlines already writing themselves across glowing screens. But Amara Brooks didn't move. Not even when a few heads turned toward her. Not even when someone nearby muttered her name like it carried weight now. She stood still beneath the cold overhead lights, her hands resting lightly over the curve of her stomach, her breathing steady, her silence louder than the chaos that followed his words. Because this wasn't the first time she had heard denial dressed up as certainty. And it wouldn't be the moment that broke her. Not here, not in front of them, not under lights that were never meant to show truth, only spectacle. And across the room, Ethan continued speaking, voice smooth, controlled, practiced, explaining timelines and reputations and the cost of false accusations. Every word designed to build distance between himself and the life she carried. Every sentence tightening the invisible line that separated power from vulnerability. But then something shifted, subtle at first. A movement near the door, a nurse stepping in too quickly for protocol, her eyes scanning until they landed on him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, not loudly, but enough, just enough to slice through the noise. And for the first time since he stepped in front of those cameras, Ethan paused, his jaw tightening slightly as irritation flickered across his face. "This isn't the time," he started, but the nurse didn't leave, didn't back down. "There's been a change," she added, and something in her tone, something precise and unmovable, made the room quiet in a different way, not curious, not hungry, but waiting. And Ethan exhaled once, slow, controlled, before turning, his shoes echoing against the polished floor as he stepped away from the microphones, away from the headlines still forming behind him. And as he passed through the doorway, the brightness of the press room collapsed into the sterile white of the hospital corridor, the air cooler, thinner, the sounds reduced to distant monitors and measured footsteps. And he walked, not rushed, not hesitant, just forward, as if control still belonged to him, as if whatever waited ahead could still be managed, explained, contained. But the hallway stretched longer than expected, each step pulling him further from the version of the story he had just told, further from the certainty he had worn like armor, until they reached the room, and the nurse stopped, her hand resting briefly against the door before pushing it open, and the light inside was softer, quieter, the kind that didn't demand attention but revealed everything anyway. And there she was again, Amara, already there, already seated, already watching, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something steadier, something that didn't need to be proven out loud. And Ethan's gaze flickered once, just once, before shifting past her to the monitor beside the bed, because that's where the nurse gestured. That's where the truth waited without voice or opinion, just data, just rhythm, just evidence that didn't care about reputation or denial. And the screen came alive in front of him, grayscale shadows resolving into something unmistakable, two distinct forms, two small movements, and then the sound, steady, synchronized, too. Heartbeats filling the room with a rhythm that didn't ask for belief. It simply existed, and beneath it, in clean, clinical text, a name, his name, Ethan Caldwell. And for the first time since the cameras found him, since the questions began, since the words left his mouth with perfect control, something inside him slipped, not loud, not visible to anyone else, but enough to make the air feel heavier in his lungs, enough to make his focus narrow to that screen, to those two steady signals that refused to disappear. And behind him the world he had just shaped continued without him, headlines forming, clips replaying, his voice echoing in rooms he could no longer hear, while here, in this quiet space, the truth didn't need volume. It didn't need witnesses. It only needed one moment, one look, one breath where denial stopped working. And Amara finally spoke, her voice low, calm, unshaken. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "But you do have to see it." And this time, there was nowhere else for him to look. The sound of the monitor did not rise or fall. It stayed steady, controlled, almost indifferent, as if it had no interest in the man standing in front of it. And Ethan Caldwell remained still, his shoulders squared, his posture unchanged, but his eyes no longer moved the way they had in the press room. They did not scan, they did not calculate. They stayed locked on the screen like something inside him had been quietly rerouted. Because numbers could be argued, stories could be rewritten, but this was neither. This was rhythm, repetition, something alive that did not need permission to exist. And he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that usually reset a conversation. But nothing reset here. Nothing returned to the version of reality he had just presented outside. And behind him the door remained slightly open, the distant echo of voices and footsteps reminding him that the world had not paused. It had only moved on without waiting for him to catch up, and Amara shifted slightly in her seat, not to draw attention, not to interrupt, but simply because she was there, present in a way that did not ask for acknowledgment, and that unsettled him more than any accusation could have, because she was not trying to win, she was not trying to prove, she had already stepped beyond that, and for a moment he almost spoke, almost reached for something familiar, a question, a dismissal, a line that would place distance back between them. But the words did not come the way they usually did. They did not line up neatly in his mind. They hesitated, fractured, and disappeared before reaching his voice, and the nurse adjusted a setting on the machine, the soft glow shifting slightly, making the two forms clearer, more defined, and the sound followed, two distinct patterns now, not just one layered over the other, but separate, undeniable. And Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to show that something inside him had started to resist, not the truth itself, but what it required from him. And he finally looked away from the screen, just for a second, just long enough to find Amara's eyes again, expecting something, anger, satisfaction, anything that would allow him to place her back into a role he understood, but there was none of it, only that same steady presence, and it forced him into unfamiliar ground, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to argue with, only the quiet weight of being seen without permission to hide. And he took a step closer to the monitor, not because he intended to accept it, but because distance no longer felt like control, and the closer he got, the more detail emerged, small movements, subtle shifts, life forming in a way that did not wait for acknowledgement, and a flicker of memory surfaced without warning. A night he had filed away as insignificant, brief, contained, something that did not extend beyond its moment, and now it stretched, expanded, reshaped itself into something that stood directly in front of him, and his hand lifted slightly, almost unconsciously, stopping just short of the edge of the machine, as if touching it would make it more real than he was prepared to handle, and the nurse glanced at him, then at Amara, sensing the shift but not interfering, because this was no longer about procedure, it was about recognition, and that could not be guided, only witnessed, and outside, somewhere beyond the walls, his voice continued to circulate, replayed, analyzed, repeated in loops that no longer matched the man standing here, and that disconnect pressed in quietly, not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to stay, and Ethan lowered his hand, his fingers curling slightly, as if holding on to something that had already slipped, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not broken, not soft, but stripped of the certainty that had filled it minutes ago. How long? He asked, not looking at her. Not yet. And Amara answered without hesitation, without triumph. Long enough to know I was not going to chase you for acknowledgement. And the words landed without force, but they did not need it, because they carried something he could not dismiss, a timeline he had not been part of, a reality that had moved forward without his consent, and for the first time, the idea that control had limits settled into him, not as a concept, but as something tangible, something he could feel in the space between his breath and the sound of those two steady heartbeats that refused to fade. The question lingered in the air long after Amara answered, and Ethan did not respond right away, not because he did not hear her, but because the answer did not fit into anything he could control, and for the first time he understood that time had moved forward without waiting for his decisions, without asking for his approval, and the realization settled quietly, heavier than any accusation could have been, because it was not directed at him. It simply existed, and he turned his head slightly, looking back at the monitor again, as if expecting the image to shift, to correct itself, to give him something he could question, but it remained the same, steady, precise, two lives forming with a rhythm that did not hesitate, and the longer he looked, the harder it became to separate himself from what he was seeing, because the distance he had created outside no longer held here. It did not reach this room, and he exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders lowering just enough to break. The perfect composure he had carried into the press room, and Amara watched him without interruption, her hands resting lightly, her posture calm, not defensive, not inviting, simply present, and that presence forced him into a space he had never occupied before, one where he was not leading, not deciding, only reacting, and it unsettled him in a way that no boardroom ever had, because there were no strategies here, no negotiations, only truth that had already taken shape, and he shifted his weight slightly, the polished floor reflecting the movement as if to remind him that he was still here, still part of this moment whether he chose to accept it or not, and the silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of everything that had not been said, everything that could no longer be avoided. And finally he spoke again, his voice quieter, not weak, but measured in a way that acknowledged something had changed. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" he asked, the question coming out more as an attempt to understand than an accusation, and Amara's expression did not change, not because she did not feel the weight of it, but because she had already lived through the answer. "Because you were never someone I could tell without losing myself in the process," she said, her tone steady, her words clear, and they landed with a precision that did not need to be raised or repeated, and Ethan looked at her fully now, not past her, not around her, but at her. And for a moment he saw something he had not allowed himself to notice before, not just strength, but decision, a line drawn long before this room, long before this moment. And it forced him to confront something deeper than the situation itself, something about who he had been in that one night he barely remembered, and who he had remained afterward. And the gap between those two versions of himself became impossible to ignore, and he swallowed once, not out of hesitation, but because the space between what he had said publicly and what he now understood had widened beyond comfort, and the nurse quietly stepped back, giving them distance without leaving, recognizing that whatever unfolded next did not belong to procedure, it belonged to them. And Ethan's gaze drifted again, back to the screen, back to the steady movement that refused to align with his earlier denial, and a subtle tension formed in his jaw, not resistance this time, but something closer to realization, and he took another step closer, his reflection faint in the monitor, overlapping briefly with the image before it separated again, as if reminding him that he was both part of this and still outside of it, and the sound of the heartbeats filled the space again, not louder, but clearer, as if his awareness had sharpened enough to hear what had always been there, and he finally let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and when he spoke this time there was no performance in it, no calculation, only a quiet acknowledgment of something he could no longer deny. "I was not there," he said, more to himself than to her, and Amara did not respond, because she did not need to, because that was the beginning of something he would have to face on his own, and the room held that moment, not as a resolution, but as a shift, subtle, undeniable, the kind that did not announce itself, but changed everything that came after. The words did not echo, they settled, quiet and irreversible, and Ethan remained where he stood, his reflection faint against the monitor as if the room itself was holding him in place, not with force but with consequence. And for a moment nothing moved except the steady flicker of life on the screen, two rhythms continuing without interruption, without hesitation, as if they had never depended on him to begin with. And that realization pressed deeper than anything spoken aloud, because it did not accuse him. It simply revealed the space he had left behind, and he lowered his gaze slightly, not away from the truth, but into it, as if looking long enough might allow him to understand something he had never needed to before, and the silence between them shifted again, not tense, not fragile, but defined, shaped by everything that had already happened and everything that could not be undone. And Amara adjusted her position slightly, her hand resting with quiet instinct, not performative, not for him, just for herself. And it was that detail, small and unspoken, that caught his attention more than anything else, because it spoke of time, of moments lived without him, decisions made without his input, a life forming in parallel to his own that had never paused to wait. And he straightened slowly, not reclaiming control, but acknowledging that whatever came next would not be dictated the way his world usually was. And when he finally turned to face her fully, there was no trace of the man who had stood before the cameras just minutes ago, only someone beginning to understand the limits of his own narrative. And he spoke carefully, each word placed without the confidence he once carried. "What happens now?" he asked, not as a demand, not as a strategy, but as a question that did not assume an answer. And Amara held his gaze for a moment before responding, not to challenge him, not to guide him, but to state something that had already been decided long before he entered the room. "Now nothing changes for me," she said, her voice even, grounded in something that did not depend on his reaction. "I was already moving forward." And the simplicity of it settled over him, not harsh, not dismissive, but final in a way he could not negotiate. And he inhaled slowly, absorbing the distance between where he stood and where she had already arrived. And for the first time, the idea of catching up, not controlling, but learning, began to take shape, unfamiliar and uncertain. And he glanced once more at the monitor, the two steady signals continuing their quiet insistence. And something shifted again, not dramatic, not immediate, but enough to alter the way he saw what was in front of him, because it was no longer abstract, no longer a possibility to be dismissed. It was presence, undeniable and ongoing. And he took a step back, giving himself space not from them, but from the version of himself that had denied them. And the nurse moved forward slightly, checking the readings with professional calm, her presence grounding the moment back into reality, back into something measurable. And Ethan watched her for a second, noticing how naturally she interacted with the process, how ordinary it seemed to everyone except him. And it struck him that what had just shifted his entire perspective was, for others, simply part of the day, another moment in a world that did not revolve around his decisions. And that understanding settled in quietly, humbling in a way he could not ignore. And when he looked back at Amara, there was no expectation in his eyes, no request for reassurance, only a recognition that whatever place he might have here would not be given. It would have to be earned. And even then, it might not be enough. And the weight of that possibility did not push him away. It held him there, steady, forcing him to remain in a space he would have once avoided. And the room felt different now, not because anything had changed externally, but because he had, even if only slightly, even if only enough to stop pretending he could walk away unchanged. And as the monitor continued its quiet rhythm, marking time in a way that did not wait or rewind, Ethan stood there longer than he needed to, not out of obligation, but because leaving too soon would have meant returning to a version of himself that no longer fit. And for the first time in a long time, he did not move to escape the moment. He stayed, letting it settle, letting it define something he had not yet fully understood but could no longer deny. He did not leave when the nurse finished her checks, even when the room settled back into its quiet routine. And that in itself felt unfamiliar, because Ethan Caldwell was a man who moved on quickly, who did not linger in spaces that demanded reflection instead of action. Yet here he remained, his gaze shifting between the monitor and the woman who had already built a path forward without him. And the contrast pressed against him in ways he could not ignore, because everything about her presence spoke of continuity, while his own felt interrupted, uncertain. And for a moment he adjusted his stance, as if trying to find footing in a situation that did not respond to confidence or control. And he cleared his throat lightly, not to fill the silence but to acknowledge it. "I need to correct what I said out there," he said finally, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier certainty. And Amara did not react immediately, not with relief, not with resistance. She simply watched him as if weighing the difference between intention and impact. And that pause held more weight than any response could have, because it reminded him that his words no longer carried automatic authority here. They had to be measured against what he had already done. And he lowered his gaze briefly before continuing. "Not for them," he added, nodding slightly toward the door where the distant noise of the press still lingered. "For this." And his eyes moved back to the monitor, to the quiet, steady evidence that had shifted everything. And Amara's expression softened just enough to register the shift, not as forgiveness, not as acceptance, but as recognition that he had taken a step beyond denial. And she inhaled slowly, her posture unchanged, her voice calm when she spoke. "Truth is not something you fix with a statement," she said, her tone even, not dismissive, but grounded in experience he had not lived. "It is something you live with after you say it." And the words settled into him with a clarity that did not leave room for shortcuts, and he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment, because for the first time he understood that correcting the narrative outside would not change what had already been created inside this room. And he turned slightly, pacing one measured step before stopping again, as if movement alone might help him process what had shifted, and the reflection of his motion passed briefly across the monitor, overlapping with the image before separating again. A quiet reminder of distance that still existed, and he ran a hand along the back of his neck, a gesture small enough to go unnoticed by most. But here it stood out, because it was not part of the composed image he had built his life on. It was unguarded, human, and Amara noticed it, not with judgment, but with the same steady awareness she had carried from the beginning. And the room held that moment, not tense, not fragile, but transitional, as if something had moved just enough to change the direction of what came next, and the nurse stepped out quietly, closing the door with a soft click that sealed the space into something more private, more contained, and Ethan glanced at the door briefly before looking back at Amara. And this time when he spoke, there was no attempt to control the outcome, only a question that acknowledged his place in the situation had shifted. "What do you need?" he asked, the words careful, deliberate, not offering solutions, not assuming answers. And Amara held his gaze for a moment, her silence stretching just long enough to make it clear that this was not a simple exchange, not something that could be resolved with a list or a plan. And when she finally responded, her voice remained steady, her words precise. "I need consistency," she said, not reaction. And the distinction settled into him immediately, because it removed the urgency he was used to, the immediate fixes, the rapid responses, and replaced them with something slower, something that required presence over time. And he absorbed it without interruption, without trying to reshape it into something easier. And he nodded once more, not as a promise, but as a recognition of what would be required if he chose to remain. And the monitor continued its quiet rhythm, marking time in a way that did not wait for decisions. And Ethan stood there, not at the center of the moment, but within it, aware now that whatever came next would not be dictated by what he said in front of cameras, but by what he did when no one was watching. And for the first time, that reality did not push him away. It held him there, steady, asking him to decide not in words, but in actions that would unfold long after this moment had passed. The word consistency did not leave the room when Amara said it. It settled into the space between them like something that could not be negotiated or reshaped. And Ethan felt it more than he understood it at first, because it did not sound like a demand. It sounded like a boundary that had already been built long before he arrived. And he stood there for a moment without speaking, letting the weight of it replace the instinct to respond. Because for once he recognized that answering too quickly would only return him to the version of himself that had created this distance in the first place. And the monitor continued its quiet rhythm beside them, steady, unchanging, marking time in a way that did not wait for either of them to decide what came next. And Ethan finally nodded again, slower this time, not as agreement, but as acceptance of something he would have to learn rather than define. And he took a step toward the window, the soft reflection of the city beyond the glass barely visible in the muted light. And for a brief moment the world he knew pressed back in, schedules, expectations, the structure that had always allowed him to stay ahead of everything. But it felt distant now, like something happening parallel to this moment rather than inside it. And he turned back to her, not with urgency, not with a plan, but with a presence that had not been there before. "I do not know how to do that yet," he said, his voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest in a way he had rarely needed to be. And Amara studied him quietly, not searching for perfection, not expecting immediate change, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be performed. And she shifted slightly, adjusting her position with care, her hand resting instinctively again. And that simple movement grounded the moment more than any words could, because it reminded him that this was not theoretical, this was happening, continuing, regardless of his readiness. And he watched that movement for a second before speaking again, slower now, more deliberate. "But I can start," he added, and the statement did not carry promise. It carried intention, and that difference was enough to hold in the room. Without breaking, and Amara exhaled softly, not as relief, but as acknowledgment that something had shifted beyond denial, and she nodded once, a small gesture that did not grant approval, but did not reject him either, and the silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It was steadier, less resistant, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would not be resolved in this room, but would unfold over time, in actions rather than words. And Ethan glanced at the monitor again, the two steady signals continuing without interruption, and this time he did not look for confirmation. He simply observed, letting the reality of it exist without trying to control how it made him feel. And the door handle turned softly, the nurse stepping back in with a clipboard, her presence practical, grounding, and she offered a brief, professional update about the readings, her tone neutral, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. And Ethan listened, not because he needed the details, but because he understood now that being present meant staying through the ordinary as well as the significant. And when she finished, he asked a question, simple, direct, about the next steps. In it was the first time his voice carried curiosity instead of control, and the nurse answered calmly, outlining what would come in the days ahead. And he nodded, absorbing it without interruption, without redirecting it into something easier. And when she stepped out again, the room returned to its quiet rhythm, and Ethan did not move toward the door. He remained where he was, his attention no longer divided between what was happening here and what was waiting outside. And Amara watched him for a moment longer before speaking, her voice steady, her words clear. "Starting is not staying," she said, not as a warning, but as a truth she had already lived. And Ethan met her gaze, not with resistance, but with recognition, because he understood now that presence was not measured in moments like this. It was measured in everything that followed. And he nodded once more, slower than before, and for the first time, the decision to remain did not feel like something he was controlling. It felt like something he was choosing, even without knowing what it would require. And the monitor continued its steady rhythm beside them, marking time, not as a countdown, but as a reminder that every second forward would carry the weight of what he chose to do next. Time did not slow down for them after that moment. It continued moving with quiet certainty, measured in the steady rhythm of the monitor and the subtle shifts in the room that marked the passing of minutes. And Ethan remained longer than he had planned, longer than anyone expected, not because he had nowhere else to be, but because leaving too soon now carried a different weight, one he could feel even without fully understanding it. And when he finally stepped back, creating a small distance between himself and the monitor, it was not an escape. It was a pause, a recognition that what he had seen would not fade the moment he walked out of the room. And he glanced once more at Amara, not searching for approval, not expecting reassurance, just acknowledging her presence in a way that had not existed before. And she met his gaze briefly before looking away, not out of avoidance, but because her focus had never depended on him. And that quiet independence settled into him again, reminding him that whatever role he might have here would not replace what she had already built. And he nodded slightly, almost to himself, before turning toward the door, his hand resting on the handle for a fraction longer than necessary, as if measuring the difference between stepping out as the man he had been and stepping out as someone beginning to understand what that meant. And when he opened it, the sound of the outside world returned immediately, louder, sharper, filled with voices that carried questions he had already answered incorrectly. And the hallway was no longer empty. Reporters lingering at a distance, phones raised, eyes tracking his movement, waiting for him to confirm or repeat what had already spread beyond the walls. And he paused for a second, the instinct to control the narrative rising automatically, familiar and practiced. But something in him held it back, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to stop him from repeating the same certainty. And one of the reporters stepped forward, her voice quick, direct. "Mr. Caldwell, do you stand by your earlier statement?" And the question hung in the air, sharp and immediate, demanding clarity, demanding consistency. And Ethan looked at her, then briefly down the hallway, where the closed door behind him marked the space he had just left. And for the first time, the answer was not ready, not polished, not designed. and he exhaled slowly, the sound grounding him just enough to choose his words instead of defaulting to them. "No," he said finally, his voice steady but no longer distant. And the reaction was immediate, a shift in the energy, cameras lifting higher, voices overlapping. But he did not rush to fill the silence this time. He did not build a statement around it. He let the single word stand, incomplete to them but accurate to where he was. And the reporter pressed again. "Then what has changed?" And he held her gaze for a moment before answering. Not with explanation, not with defense, but with something simpler. "I have seen enough to know I was wrong," he said, and the words did not carry the authority they once would have. They carried something quieter, something that did not seek approval, and the hallway reacted around him, voices rising, questions multiplying, but he did not stay to manage it. He did not expand. He did not clarify, because for the first time, the story outside did not define what mattered inside, and he moved forward, past the questions, past the cameras, not avoiding them, but no longer shaped by them. And as he walked, the sound of the monitor lingered in his memory, steady, unchanging, a rhythm that did not depend on public statements or private hesitation, and it followed him even as he stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft finality that separated him from the noise, leaving him alone with the reflection in the mirrored walls. And he looked at himself for a moment, not critically, not analytically, just observing, as if trying to recognize the difference that had already begun to form. And the elevator descended quietly, each floor passing without announcement. And when the doors opened again, the world outside looked the same, the city moving with its usual pace. But something in him did not match it anymore, not fully, not yet. And he stepped forward into it anyway, carrying with him something that could not be explained in a statement or corrected in a headline, something that would only take shape over time, in actions that no one would see at first, but that would define everything that came after. The city did not react to his shift. It moved the same way it always did, traffic rolling through intersections, lights changing on schedule, people crossing streets without looking up long enough to notice that something had altered in a man who used to control rooms with a sentence. And Ethan stepped into it with a pace that felt slightly out of rhythm with everything around him, not slower, not hesitant, just different, as if each step carried more weight than it had an hour ago, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed faintly in his mind, overlapping with something else, something quieter, the steady pattern he could still hear even without the machine in front of him. And he reached his car, but did not open the door immediately, his hand resting against the handle as he looked out over the street, not searching for anything specific, just letting the moment extend long enough to register that the version of control he relied on had limits. And when he finally got inside, the familiar interior did not settle him the way it usually did. It felt like a space designed for movement, for decisions, for forward motion, but not for what he was carrying now. And he started the engine, the low hum filling the silence, but he did not pull away right away. Instead, he sat there, one hand on the wheel, the other resting still, as if he was waiting for something to align, something that would make the next step clear. But clarity did not come in the form he expected. It came in fragments, in the memory of her words, in the image of the monitor, in the realization that what mattered now would not be decided in a single moment. And he finally drove, not toward his office, not toward the schedule that had been set hours before, but back toward the hospital, the decision quiet, almost instinctive. And when he arrived again, the energy outside had shifted slightly, the reporters still present but less focused, their attention divided as the initial surge of reaction settled into ongoing coverage. And Ethan moved past them without stopping, not avoiding them, just not engaging. And the hallway felt different this time, less unfamiliar, more grounded, as if stepping back into it confirmed something he had already started. And when he reached the door, he paused again, not out of hesitation, but to recognize that returning was not the same as arriving. It carried intention now, and he stepped inside, the room unchanged in its quiet, the monitor still marking time with steady precision. And Amara looked up briefly, not surprised, not questioning, just aware, and he nodded once, not as a greeting, but as acknowledgment that he had come back by choice. And he moved to the chair near the wall, not too close, not distant, simply present. And for a while neither of them spoke, the silence holding a different shape now, less guarded, more settled, as if both of them understood that words were no longer the primary measure of what mattered. And the nurse entered and exited again, updating charts, adjusting settings, her movements part of a rhythm that continued regardless of who was in the room. And Ethan watched, not because he needed to, but because he was learning how to stay in moments that did not revolve around him. And time passed, not dramatically, not marked by any single event, but by the accumulation of small choices. Staying seated, asking a question about timing, listening without redirecting. And each of those choices built something subtle but real, something that did not erase what had happened, but began to exist alongside it. And at one point Amara spoke again, her voice calm, measured. "Showing up once does not change anything," she said, not looking directly at him, her focus steady elsewhere. And Ethan nodded, not defensively, not trying to justify. "I know," he replied. And the simplicity of that exchange held more weight than any explanation, because it acknowledged the gap, without trying to close it prematurely. And the monitor continued its steady rhythm, marking time not as something to be chased, but as something to be honored. And Ethan remained there as the light in the room shifted slightly with the passing of the afternoon, not checking his watch, not reaching for his phone, allowing the world outside to continue without his immediate involvement. And for the first time in a long time, that absence of control did not feel like loss. It felt like the beginning of something he had never built before, something that would not be measured in statements or decisions made under pressure, but in the quiet consistency of choosing to return, to remain, and to learn what it meant to be present in a life that had already begun without him. Evening settled slowly outside the hospital windows, the light fading from bright white to a softer gray that stretched across the room without asking permission. And Ethan remained in the same chair he had chosen hours ago, not out of obligation, not because anyone expected it, but because leaving now would have felt like stepping back into a version of himself that no longer fit. And the rhythm of the monitor continued, steady and unchanged, marking time in a way that did not pause for reflection, did not adjust for regret. It simply moved forward, and for the first time he did not measure that movement against what he had lost or what he needed to fix. He let it exist as something he had to follow, not lead. And Amara shifted slightly as the nurse finished another routine check, her movements calm, familiar, grounded in a rhythm she had built long before he chose to return. And when the nurse stepped out again, the room settled into a quiet that no longer felt tense. It felt defined, shaped by everything that had already happened and everything that had not yet been decided. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely together, not in control, not in defense, just present. And he spoke after a moment, his voice low, steady, not searching for approval. "I am not asking you to change anything for me," he said, each word deliberate. "I am asking for the chance to meet them as they are, when they arrive." And the statement did not rush. It did not carry expectation. It held in the space between them without pressure. And Amara looked at him then, fully, her gaze steady, not softened, not hardened, simply clear. And for a moment she did not respond, allowing the weight of his words to settle without interruption. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded in the same certainty she had carried from the beginning. "They are not an opportunity," she said quietly. "They are a responsibility you did not choose, but they are still yours." And the words did not push him away. They anchored him in something that could not be reframed. And he nodded once, slower than before, not in agreement alone, but in understanding that what stood ahead of him would not be shaped by intention alone. And the silence returned again, but this time it carried something new, not resolution, not forgiveness, but direction, subtle and unspoken. And outside the window the city lights began to appear, one by one, small points of brightness against the fading sky. And Ethan noticed them without turning his head fully, aware of how the world continued to move, to build, to exist beyond this room. And yet for the first time, he did not feel the need to return to it immediately. He allowed himself to remain where he was, in a space that required nothing from him except presence. And after a while, he stood, not abruptly, not as an escape, but as a transition, and he took a step closer, stopping at a respectful distance, not crossing the line that had already been drawn. And he looked once more at the monitor, the steady rhythm unchanged, the quiet proof. Continuing without interruption. And then he looked at Amara, not expecting a response, not asking for permission, simply acknowledging the reality that connected them now in a way he could not deny. And she met his gaze briefly before returning her attention forward, her posture steady, her focus unchanged. And that was enough, not as acceptance, not as rejection, but as truth. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath grounding him in the moment before he turned toward the door. And this time when he reached it, he did not hesitate, because leaving did not mean stepping away from what he had seen. It meant carrying it forward. And when he stepped into the hallway, the noise had faded, the reporters gone, the space quieter, almost ordinary, and he paused for a second, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that what came next would not be marked by a single decision. It would be built in moments like this, unseen, unannounced, consistent, and as he walked away, the sound of those two steady heartbeats remained with him, not as a reminder of what he had denied, but as a measure of what he would have to become. And somewhere behind him, in that quiet room, the rhythm continued, unchanged, waiting not for his words, but for his actions.